Howdy do! If you're new here, you should know that this is part 2 of a 3-part episode. If you missed the first part, I highly recommend you check that out first. If you don't, you're going to be a little confused. Last time, we covered our 3 war boys, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and Robert Graves, and their lives prior to engaging in the war. Now, each one joined the war almost from the beginning. If they hadn't, they'd have seen what kind of pressure young men faced in the streets of the United Kingdom. While there wouldn't be an official conscription in the UK until 1916, there was what is probably best described as a civilian conscription. Young men of fighting age were given harsh looks on the streets. Relatives would pester those who didn't go to war until they relented. Organizations like the White Feather Brigade sprung up. The White Feather Brigade, sometimes called the Order of the White Feather, was a group of women who would pin white feathers to unenlisted men as a way of publicly shaming them and calling them cowards. It also backfired somewhat when soldiers, who had come home on leave or due to injury, would also be harassed in the streets. Several soldiers who didn't usually walk around in their full uniforms were also presented with white flowers of cowardice. Most notably, George Sampson, who had been awarded a Victoria Cross for his bravery in the war, was given a white feather on his way to a ceremony that was being held to honor him. So while their intentions may have been good, the White Feather campaign was not always well received. J.R.R. Tolkien, who wouldn't join the army until 1915, mentions in his letters the foul looks he would get when he would walk down the street, and the constant badgering of his relatives as to why he hadn't joined the war yet. As time went on, he described the pressure coming from his relatives evolving from glances to snide comments to outright letters telling him to just go to war. With all this civilian propaganda and pressure, you'd think the government would just sit back and let that work. However, the British government decided to also get involved. They recruited several well-known writers to make pamphlets and stories in support of the war effort. Several authors you've probably heard of were involved in various levels of support. Most notably, at least to me, were Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle, Jungle Book author Rudyard Kipling, and sci-fi pioneer H.G. Wells. Wells, in fact, coined one of World War I's most popular nicknames when he published his book, The War That Will End War, which is sometimes remembered as The War to End All Wars. Shortly before the war, Wells was also responsible for publishing several sets of rules for playing tabletop war games with toy soldiers. If only the war had stayed on the table. Even John Masefield, the poet Siegfried Sassoon had parodied in his first poem, contributed to the war effort. During the war, he took a 3-month lecture circuit in the U.S. and used it to take the average American's temperature about the war. He would later pass on his findings directly to the UK government, giving them first-hand knowledge of how effective their propaganda was and how best to counter the German propaganda in the US. In these circles of authors and propagandists, a common phrase was used to reflect the feeling on the war. It was taken from the Roman poet Horace, and it is, if you'll forgive my Latin, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Literally translated as it is sweet and proper to die for one's country. Though scholar John Conington, in his 1869 translation of the work the line came from, translated it as the more poetic, "What joy for fatherland to die." No one pushed this idea more than poet Jessie Pope, a notable member of the White Feather campaign. She wrote pro-war poems aplenty and was known for her rather simplistic style. And I'm not using simplistic here to be negative. In fact, the simplicity of her style was by design. and proof that she understood the assignment. You don't want complicated rhyme schemes when writing her style of propaganda poems. You want them to be simple and memorable and applicable to the most common denominator, something that's a lot harder to do than people think it is. It was no surprise to me that she would use her skills after the war to write children's books, which require similar skills of simplification. Now I could keep explaining her work, but her work is best understood simply by listening to it. So rather than me blathering on about her, I'll just read you her poem, Who's for the Game? Who's for the game, the biggest that's played, the red crashing game of a fight? Who'll grip and tackle the job unafraid, and who thinks he'd rather sit tight? Who'll toe the line for the signal to go? Who'll give his country a hand? Who wants a turn to himself in the show? And who wants a seat in the stand? Who knows it won't be a picnic? Not much, yet eagerly shoulders a gun? Who would much rather come back with a crutch than lie low and be out of the fun? Come along, lads, but you'll come on all right, for there's only one course to pursue. Your country is up to her neck in a fight, and she's looking and calling for you. Simple, effective, and pro-war. Poets like Pope, the government, and the populace worked together as one to push men to enlist. Now let's see what they've gotten themselves into. As I mentioned last time, Siegfried Sassoon joined the war as soon as it started. He joined the Sussex Yeomanry, a regiment that had been created during the Napoleonic Wars as a volunteer cavalry unit. During the Second Boer War, the Sussex Yeomanry became more of a mounted infantry unit, and by World War I, they were largely just a defensive unit designed to stay in the UK. Sassoon joined them as soon as it became clear war was coming. However, before he could head off to war, Sassoon broke his arm in a horse riding accident. So, Siegfried Sassoon would miss the opening salvos of the war. Which was probably good, as during the opening days of the war, the Western Front, which is where our focus will be, was not going well for the Entente. The Germans had been advancing using what is known as the Schlieffen Plan, though Schlieffen himself would probably have disagreed if he'd still been alive. The Schlieffen Plan was Germany's plan to smash through Belgium and push through France so they could quickly capture Paris and knock France out of the war before Russia could finish mobilizing. This plan would prevent Germany from being locked into a two-front war with probably the two strongest land powers in the war, France and Russia. Germany would win these opening battles and would be constantly advancing. During the first few months of the war, the Germans would get within 25 miles of Paris. French troops and the British Army in France, known then as the British Expeditionary Force, were pushed back again and again. We covered in the first episode this idea of the cult of the offensive. As you may recall, the cult of the offensive was this military theory that boiled down to, if you're attacking, you're winning. Well, for the first few months of the war, it was pretty much correct on the Western Front. The Germans attacked and won, pushing the French and British back. But the theory would be conclusively tested at the First Battle of the Marne. The French and British, continually facing defeats, retreated to the valley of the Marne River and set up defensive positions. The Germans wanted one thing: to get to Paris. The Marne River Valley was pretty much the last stop on their path. In a battle that lasted nearly 2 weeks, the French and the British held firm and stopped the German offensive. Not ones to give up easily, Germany would continue to try and attack and outflank, leading to a series of battles known as the Race to the Sea. This would effectively establish the front line of the war to come, as neither side was able to conclusively win and wound up digging trenches and building defensive fortifications. If you look at a map of World War I battle lines, the Western Front doesn't noticeably move from the end of 1914 to the beginning of 1918. Fighting still happens and lines do move, but there is no significant changes. No noticeable victories. In 4 months, the Germans had done nothing but advance. Now, both sides were effectively dug in. The war started in August 1914. The final battle of the Race to the Sea, the Battle of Ypres, ended towards the end of November 1914. During this 4-month window, the battle casualties were well over 1 million, which is a lot. It's hard to actually explain how shocking this number is when you put it in the context of warfare up to that point. If you look at the Napoleonic Wars, which was actually like 7 wars over a 12-year period, you'll see total casualties ranging from 3 to 7 million. So even on the surface, over 1 million in 4 months seems like a lot. But consider this. The vast majority of war casualties prior to World War I came from disease and other war-adjacent causes. One of the best examples of this is Napoleon's infamous invasion of Russia, a military disaster so bad that even people largely ignorant of history could tell you about it, quoting some old cliché like never invade Russia during the winter. Some historians estimate the casualties from this invasion to be roughly 1 million, with the vast majority of them coming from disease and the climate. So, 100 years before World War I, the bar was set. 1 million casualties is shocking and a disaster that will never be forgotten by history. Here's the thing. One of the greatest military disasters of all time resulted in the same number of casualties as the first 4 months on the Western Front of World War I alone. And at this point, World War I didn't have disease or the cold to blame. Just bullets, shells, and the horrors of modern war. Disease and the weather would play a role in World War I, don't get me wrong, but for the first 4 months, the vast majority of casualties were caused by battles. The first time in history that this was true. And remember, there's a whole nother front to this war. These numbers don't count the Eastern Front, or the Serbian Front, or anything but the Western Front. So we have to ask, who's ready for the game? Now I know this podcast is supposed to be about the storytellers, but I've got to set this up. You've got to understand what our war boys are walking into. Graves is training, Sassoon is injured but will begin training when he's better, and Owen hasn't enlisted yet. He's still tutoring in France. They're going to step into a world shaped by these opening salvos. And as I said, the Western Front is going to effectively freeze in place after this. So once we're done here, we can focus on the people, I promise. That being said, I also understand your desire to get back to them, and I promise we're almost done with these authorless war bits. But we've got to cover one last thing, and we're only going to be there relatively quickly. I said in the first episode that World War I is often overlooked. But one thing people might recognize is Gallipoli, if only because it is considered one of Winston Churchill's greatest failures. The idea of it, however, made some sense. The Ottoman Empire, a member of the Central Powers, controlled what are known as the Ottoman Straits. These straits connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea and were located right next to the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, not Constantinople. These straits were the easiest way for the Western powers of the Entente to trade with and supply Russia. With the Ottoman entry into the war in late 1914, the Straits became nobody's business but the Turks. The Entente desperately wanted to control the Straits and weaken the Ottoman Navy's ability to threaten ships crossing the nearby Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the fastest way for Europe to access the East. Remember that the European powers had a lot of colonies in Asia. For the United Kingdom especially, reducing the threat on the Suez Canal would make getting troops and supplies from places like India, Australia, and New Zealand much easier. Thus, the Dardanelles Campaign, often referred to as the Gallipoli Campaign, began. It lasted from February of 1915 to early 1916. The end result? The Ottomans still controlled the Straits. Winston Churchill was demoted and disgraced, and another 500,000 casualties were added to the list. One of these casualties came in November of 1915. Hamo Sassoon, Siegfried's younger brother, would die after having his leg amputated. That same month, Siegfried is transferred to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and is shipped off to France to join the fight. Siegfried Sassoon has entered the war the same month that war took his brother away. Upon arriving in France, he meets another poet, Robert Graves, one of our war boys. Graves had finished his training a bit earlier and had been transferred to the 1st Battalion in France. The two became fast friends. While Sassoon doesn't necessarily make much of an artistic change on Graves, Graves and the war changes Sassoon. Sassoon came into the war a romantic poet. His first published poem was a parody, remember? But after he meets Graves and sees the war, Sassoon changes. He adopts a gritty, realistic style, and his poems become harsh and visceral. As a soldier, Sassoon is described as equal parts brave and insane. He earns the nickname Mad Jack for his insane acts of bravery and heroism. Graves would later describe Sassoon's acts as almost suicidal. And it's not a hard case to make. The more Sassoon sees of the war, the more depressed he gets. The more depressed he gets, the more he acts bravely, showing less and less concern for his own life. Because of this bravery, Sassoon was well liked as a soldier and trusted as a commander. Graves and Sassoon were becoming friends as they fought through the war, and our third war boy, Wilfred Owen, begins training to join the front around this time. June of 1916, in fact. Now, he won't make it to France until December of that year, so what will our other war boys do between July and November 1916? Well, first let's start with a nice thing. Graves' first book of poems, Over the Brazier, is published around this time. It contains a mix of the poems from his youth and his more recent war poems. I ended our last episode with his playful poem Willory, which was published in Over the Brazier. Do you remember it? It was playful and youthful and carefree. That poem was published in the same collection as the poem Limbo, which I'll read for you now. After a week spent under raining skies, in horror, mud, and sleeplessness, a week of bursting shells, of blood and hideous cries, and the ever-watchful sniper, where the reek of death offends the living, but poor dead can't sleep, must lie awake with the horrid sound that roars and whirs and rattles overhead, all day, all night, and jars and tears the ground. When rats run big as kittens to and fro, they dart and scuffle with their horrid fare, and then one night relief comes, and we go miles back into the sunny cornland where babies like tickling, and where tall white horses draw the plow leisurely and quiet courses. Tonally, the two are a little inconsistent, but I think that's the point. We see Graves go from a happy go lucky boy to a war hardened man. One of the main themes of this book is Graves' impending sense that he will die soon. We'll see if he's right, or if he's just smelling the death that is to come. Those of you who came into this with a bit of World War I knowledge may well have perked up when I mentioned that we were going to cover July 1916 through November 1916, because those dates happen to line up exactly with the Battle of the Somme. We're almost 2 years into the war, but the Western Front hasn't changed much since we left it. The two sides are still locked into trench warfare, and neither side is able to make much headway. New technologies and theories are put into the field to attempt to break the stalemate. The use of planes became widespread, and their uses evolved from scouting and surveillance to actual combat roles. Tanks were invented and tried on the field to mixed effect. Chemical warfare was used on a massive scale by both sides, most notably with chlorine gas. Gas was one of the most feared things in the war for the average soldier, but in terms of changing the course of a battle or making any headway, it's never that effective. Nothing is that effective. It doesn't make it any easier for your average soldier, though. Shells are constantly falling, gas is a constant fear, giant metal machines are now rolling towards you, and death taints the land around you. Not quite the idealistic vision of Arthurian knights that young men had been sold on. Sassoon nails this idea in his poem, The Poet as a Hero. You've heard me, scornful, harsh, and discontented, mocking and loathing war. You've asked me why, of my old silly sweetness I've repented. My ecstasy's changed to an ugly cry. You are aware that once I sought the Grail, riding in armor bright, serene, and strong, and it was told that through my infant wail there rose immortal semblances of song. But now I've said goodbye to Galahad, and am no more the knight of dreams and show. For lust and senseless hatred make me glad, and my killed friends are with me where I go. Wound for red wound I burn to smite their wrongs, and there is absolution in my songs. Sassoon, and soldiers like him, have quickly realized that war is not like the stories. It's not like the songs. It's dirty and horrifying and painful. And there are few greater examples of war's horrors than the Battle of the Somme. Using everything they can, the Entente decides to attack. The offensive would last 4 months. We're not going to dive too deep into it, but we'll cover the results. First, this offensive solidifies Sassoon as an insane hero. Graves would later describe Sassoon taking a German trench by himself during the Somme, in a book we'll cover later called Goodbye to All That. In it, he says, he went over with bombs in daylight, under covering fire from a couple of rifles, and scared away the occupants. A pointless feat, since instead of signaling for reinforcements, he sat down in the German trench and began reading a book of poems which he had brought with him. When he went back, he did not even report. Colonel Stockwell, then in command, raged at him. The attack on Mametz Wood had been delayed for 2 hours because British patrols were still reported to be out. British patrols were Siegfried and his book of poems. Beyond his solo search for a good spot to read poems, Siegfried would also be awarded a military cross on July 27th for another act of heroism. The dedication read, "For conspicuous gallantry during a raid on the enemy's trenches. He remained for 1.5 hours under rifle and bomb fire, collecting and bringing in our wounded. Owing to his courage and determination, all the killed and wounded were brought in." Well, Siegfried got a medal. You probably think this means the army appreciates him. But you should know they spelled his name wrong on the medal. About a week before Sassoon earned his award, Graves was hit by an artillery shell. A fragment from the shell pierced his chest and shot through his lung. This wound was, in a way, foretold twice. First, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote frequently in his poetry book that he thought he would die soon. Secondly, he was nearly killed as a child when he got double pneumonia in his lungs. Now, his lungs were pierced, and it almost seems fitting that his lungs would be the thing to finally kill him. The army would officially declare Graves as dead and sent a letter to his mother, saying, "Dear Mrs. Graves, I very much regret to have to write and tell you your son has died of wounds. He was very gallant and was doing so well and is a great loss. He was hit by a shell and very badly wounded, and died on the way down to the base, I believe. He was not in bad pain, and our doctor managed to get across and attend him at once. We have had a very hard time, and our casualties have been large. Believe me, you have all our sympathy in your loss, and we have lost a very gallant soldier. Please write to me if I can tell you or do anything." And so the first of our war boys dies. However, on July 21st, the army noticed something strange. Graves hadn't actually died. He was just wounded. He was taken to a hospital in France for emergency treatment before being sent back to the UK. After he was physically healed, Graves would stay away from the front lines, effectively knocking our first war boy out of the war. Why didn't he return? To quote the man himself, "I thought of going back to France, but realized the absurdity of the notion. Since 1916, the fear of gas obsessed me. Any unusual smell, even a sudden strong scent of flowers in a garden, was enough to send me trembling. And I couldn't face the sound of heavy shelling now. The noise of a car backfiring would send me flat on my face or running for cover." So, Sassoon got a medal, Graves got the hell out of there, and Owens wasn't there yet. That's what the war boys got out of the Somme. And for those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, you may know that Tolkien fought in the Battle of the Somme as well. It would be his final battle of the war as he contracted trench fever and was sent home permanently. And those are the poet's results, but what about the broader picture? Well, the Entente gained about 6 miles. The British Army gained a new record with the first day of the Somme being the bloodiest day in the history of their army, and our casualty counter gained over 1 million new names. 1 million casualties for 6 miles of war-torn dirt. If you had laid them end to end, the bodies of the casualties would have gone well over 1,000 miles, which I know is an absurd way of looking at it. But I don't know of a way to look at 1 million casualties in a way that isn't absurd. In August of 1916, Sassoon is given medical leave to go to Somerville Hospital with gastric fever. After the horrors of war, Sassoon describes his first few days in Somerville as paradise. So much so that when his medical leave is over and he is ordered back to the front lines, Sassoon refuses. He was heavily encouraged by his pacifist friends in England to do so. Sassoon is well connected in English circles with many prominent thinkers and writers. The most notable member of his circle, at least to me, is Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell is a mathematician who is the author of Principia Mathematica and the founder of analytic philosophy. Admittedly, I only know of him from an episode of the British show QI, where they show his proof of 1 plus 1 equaling 2. Sassoon had grown tired of the war, and he did not want to go back. To give you an idea of where his head was at, I'm going to read you his poem Suicide in the Trenches, which came out around this time. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. That poem hits me as hard today as it did the first time I heard it. That last part, where he attacks the crowds for glorifying the nightmare he's lived through, is so powerful. In fact, let's get some more Sassoon writing in here. As part of his refusal to return to active service, he writes a letter to his commanding officer laying out his reasons. He also sends this letter to the British press. The letter reads, I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that the war upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them, and that had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attainable by negotiation. I have seen and endured the suffering of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practiced upon them. Also, I believe it may help to destroy the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not enough imagination to realize. Not content with his displeasure only coming in the form of a letter, Sassoon took the physical step of throwing his military cross into a river. His letter hit England like an artillery shell. The pacifists in England loved it. It was read out loud in the House of Commons. It made Sassoon a minor celebrity. But others called it treasonous, since it was a rebellious act against the war, and they called for Sassoon to be court-martialed. Robert Graves intervened and wrote a letter to Sassoon's commander, urging him not to court-martial Sassoon. He claimed that Sassoon wasn't a traitor, he was just shell-shocked, which is the World War I equivalent of PTSD. And to be fair, this wasn't really a lie. Sassoon and Graves would both suffer from PTSD pretty much for the rest of their lives. Graves' argument works, and instead of being punished, Sassoon is sent to the Craig Lockhart War Hospital to be treated for shell shock. While there, he encounters and helps another young poet struggling with shell shock. That poet was Wilfred Owen. You see, Owen entered the war in December of 1916. He was so excited to join the war, he would describe having a, quote, heroic feeling of being in France. Remember, reality hasn't made its way back to England yet. War is still a fantastical concept, and soldiers were larger-than-life heroes. Less than a month in France is all it took for Owen to change completely. He arrived in December of 1916. January 1917, his unit suffers a vicious gas attack, which would inspire a poem we'll cover a little later. Now, I could tell you about the next few months, but why have me describe it? Let me just quote the British military's description of the next few months. It's worth noting that the British military used some shorthand at the time, and I'm going to replace that with a longer version just so it's clearer for you. Just in case you ever go look at this source and say, well, that's not what that podcast guy told me. And if you do want to check it out, the document is available online for free through the UK National Archives. In March 1917, he fell down a well at Bouchois and was momentarily stunned. He was under medical treatment for 3 weeks and then resumed duty. About the middle of April, he was blown up by a shell explosion while he was asleep. On May 1st, he was observed to be shaky and tremulous, and his conduct and manner were peculiar, and his memory was confused. The regimental medical officer sent him to No. 41 Stationary Hospital, Gailey, where he was under observation and treatment by Captain Brown, Royal Army Medical Corps neurological specialist, for a month. On June 7, 1917, he was transferred to No. 1 General Hospital, Etretat, and on June 16, 1917, to a Welsh hospital, Netley. There is little abnormality to be observed, but he seems to be of a highly strung temperament. He has slept well while here. He leaves hospital today, transferred to Craiglockhart War Hospital, Edinburgh, for special observation and treatment. Owen was late to the war, but he really got the full experience in his first 6 months. He was gassed, shelled, and he fell down a well. I have seen some reports that the well he fell in was not a water well, but a hole blown in the ground by artillery. Either way, gone are the days of his heroic view of war. It was replaced with the gritty realism of his experiences. He's not going to use phrases like heroic feeling anymore. His arrival at Craiglockhart changed a lot of things for Owen. He worked with the doctors, not just on his shell shock, but on other psychological issues in his life. This involved him working on his relationship with his parents, his homosexuality, his struggling faith, and his desire to both serve in and protest against the war. He also decides while there that he's going to be a poet. His doctor encouraged this, offering him the ability to edit Hydra, the hospital's journal. Owen's struggling faith also found an object of worship that he could believe in: Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon's protest of the war, while being an active soldier, made Owen his number one fan. And when Sassoon joined Owen, Owen was starstruck. It took him quite some time to work up the courage to even approach Siegfried, let alone reveal that he was a poet too. Once he did, however, Sassoon embraced him with open arms. If you asked Wilfred Owen what Sassoon did for him while he was at Craiglockhart, he would talk your ear off with Sassoon's praises. He would regale you with tales of how Sassoon solidified him in his new role as a poet. He would also say that Sassoon gave birth to a new Wilfred Owen, and he would give Sassoon full credit for the poet he was, and would call him his savior. If you asked Siegfried Sassoon what he did for Owen while he was at Craiglockhart, he would tell you that he only offered the slightest touch of guidance, describing his role as one of encouragement rather than offering any real teaching or influence. He simply offered encouragement while Owen became who he was. Sassoon would, for the rest of his life, praise Owen as the far superior poet, admitting that Owen was far more creative and inventive with things like rhyme structure than he was. The two grew very close during this time, and maybe the most important thing that Sassoon did for Owen was introduce him to the literary circle he was a part of. This let Owen into a whole new world. He would regularly write letters to poets and publishers and quickly became a part of the inner circle, as it were. Graves, for example, who I remind you is pretty much out of the war at this point, would often exchange letters with Owen, despite the fact that they hadn't even met face to face. So, our war boys have all been introduced. They've all served, and they've all been hospitalized. They shared one other trait. They were pioneers of this new wave of war poetry. Gone were the heroic feelings, and the pride, and the fantasy. Instead, they introduced the world to the reality of war, the horror of war, or as Owen would describe it, the pity of war. When describing what his first book of poetry would be about, he described it as follows. This book is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them. Nor is it about deeds or land, nor anything about glory, honor, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war, and the pity of war. To describe the change these poets had on how war is perceived, it's hard to explain exactly how influential it was. It's comparable in a way to the Vietnam War. Vietnam was described as the first televised war, with many people crediting the television coverage with changing how Americans viewed war. To really oversimplify things, people saw the realities of war on film and realized how horrible war was. That's basically the same thing that happened here. For the first time, soldiers were speaking about the realities of war in popular media, changing how people viewed war. Right now, we're in late 1917, which means we've only got one more year of war. For the last bit of this episode, we'll quickly cover the final year of the war for each of our war boys. That way, Part 3 can focus solely on the aftermath. Graves, as I already mentioned, is largely done with the war. In late 1917, he's assigned to a garrison unit in the UK. Towards the end of the war, he would be stationed in Limerick, which is a fitting place for a poet, and he began to feel ill. Convinced that he had contracted Spanish flu, Graves abandoned his post and fled to England, determined to die on English soil. This, if you didn't know, is an act of desertion. Due to a stroke of luck, however, as he reached England, he ran into an officer as he got into a taxi, and that officer signed papers relieving him from his service, making his technical desertion no longer an issue. He would marry Nancy Nicholson in 1918, and the two would live together as the war ended. Sassoon, despite leaving and protesting the war, re-entered the war, first in Ireland as a trainer, then in Egypt, and finally back in France. While in France, Sassoon was injured due to friendly fire and was sent back to England as the war ended. A nice capstone, as he started the war injured and ended the war injured. Owen would also rejoin the war. In the trenches, he starts to put together his first book of poetry. He creates introductions for each poem and drafts a table of contents. He is also in contact with a publisher in England, who is excited to publish the book as soon as Owen is ready. In September 1918, Owen returns to France. In October, he is nominated for the Military Cross, the same medal his idol Sassoon won. Owen is thrilled believing this medal will give his new book of poems the credibility it needs. During this time, Owen is consistently praised for his leadership and his inspiring presence. Sassoon got similar praise. Something about these poets just makes soldiers want to follow him. When Owen was eventually awarded his medal in 1919, the citation read, "On the company commander becoming a casualty, he assumed command and showed fine leadership, and resisted a heavy counterattack. He personally manipulated a captured enemy machine gun from an isolated position and inflicted considerable losses on the enemy. Throughout, he behaved most gallantly." Now we're almost done here, but I've got one last war boy story for you. November 4th, 1918. Owen and his company are crossing a canal as part of the Battle of the Sambre. Owen is leading the group of men he's in charge of from the front, as all inspiring leaders do. As they're crossing the canal, they're spotted by a German machine gunner. The machine gunner pulls the trigger. Owen, leading from the front, is hit and will die on the field. He was 25 years old. A week later, the armistice would be signed, largely ending the hostilities between the Entente and the Central Powers. Wilfred Owen's mother would later say that she got the message that her son had died the same day they heard about the armistice, and the local bells were ringing in celebration. So I'll ask you again, who's for the game? Speaking of Jessie Pope, Wilfred Owen wrote a poem that he originally dedicated to her, though by the time it's published, the dedication will be removed. This is the poem about the gas attack from January of 1917 that I mentioned earlier. The poem is called Dulce et decorum est, which you may remember is the old propaganda phrase. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory. The old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. The old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Thank you for listening. This has been part 2 of my 3-part series on World War I war poets. Join me next week as we cover the aftermath of the war and see how our war boys adjust to life after war. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions for a storyteller for me to cover, feel free to reach out on Twitter at StoryOfStoryTLR, or if you've abandoned Twitter, which is completely reasonable, feel free to email me at storyofthestorytellers@gmail.com. Finally, to steal a quote from a pair of goofs, Soupy Twists.